Usually at this stage it would be my privilege to abuse you with my reflections and so on. I think we'll move straight to the questions. So could we get the microphones going, Edward and Ting? All right. Do we have any questions? Do you have any questions? Up at the top there on the left.
Yeah, I don't think I really need that. But no, I'm Tony Ravlich, Chairperson of the Human Rights Council. Something that you might find interesting, I've just submitted my manuscript to my publisher, and it's got a lot about the Bill of Rights. And I see the Bill of Rights, well, after all, you've got to realise there's a billion New Zealanders that live overseas. Things that happened since 1984 didn't suit everybody, did it? So what I'm saying with the Bill of Rights is that it was actually hijacked by and for a left minority, passed by only 36% of Parliament, and it wasn't the rights that were included that was the problem, it was the rights that were omitted. Because the rights that were omitted meant people were treated with gross neglect. Children, for example. Children's rights left out, treated with gross neglect. Individual self-determination left out. Small entrepreneurs, all treated with gross neglect.
Sorry,
so
there's lots of people who want to ask questions, so we're coming to it?
Right. Can I just add one further thing? If you think that's a big deal, see what's happening at the United Nations. I describe it. It's mind-blowing that you wouldn't have been told that. Okay?
Thank you. Is there a question? Think down there. Thank you.
I was just wondering to what extent, both socially and legally, you consider the Magna Carta to be a formative document in linking the rule of law with rights and liberties in a more general sense?
That sounds like a good question for the Chief Justice.
Very good question, Chief Justice. Well, I think it is. It was interesting that Eleanor Roosevelt, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being settled, said she hoped it would be a Magna Carta for the world. So I certainly think that rights talk comes out of the ideas that we can see in Magna Carta. That's not to say they were necessarily imminent in it, but certainly it's interesting that Magna Carta's looked to for legitimacy for that development. But it is all about curbing arbitrary power. Yes. Did you want to say anything?
No, I just thought, really, if you look at some of the so much of the work that's been done, in particularly the 20th century, over the concept of rights, or even human rights having being an ideal as well as something people are striving for, they always reference back to the Magna Carta. And I think that one of the things the Magna Carta is it's very much about rights, not only about obligations, and that's probably quite new at that time. I don't know the historian, maybe I'll say otherwise, but it's certainly something where it's a manifestation of a concept that people actually had rights.
Okay. Leo?
Shall I add to that? Sorry, I was just going to say that I think...
Sorry, we're short on time.
Oh, sorry.
So
Carry on. Another question?
A microphone to Leo, please. So Leo's managing the social media here, then he'll be picking up a question here.
All right. No.
Thank you very much. So I've received 3 questions from viewers of the live stream in Canterbury, and I'll start with the first for Dr. Lindsay Diggerman. Why do the United States still hold the Magna Carta dear today after their independence?
Why do the United States still hold Magna Carta dear today? A good question, because a lot of people have suggested that it's more important to the American political and legal imagination than it is to the British and Commonwealth. It's important to both, but some have said it's more important in America. The track that the ideas of Magna Carta followed was a long one, and in the 17th century, British parliamentarians took up the cause of Magna Carta in their fight against the Stuart kings. Now, at that time, many British people emigrated to what would later become the United States of America, so there was a long tradition of protests against arbitrary rule in the colonies. And when, in the 1770s, they were fighting against their British overlords, the sorts of freedoms that they saw as having been in Magna Carta were still very relevant. Now, I mentioned the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson and his colleagues looked back not so much to Magna Carta itself, but to the 17th century British version of what Magna Carta was all about, and they took inspiration from that. So it's been absolutely central to the Declaration of Independence, to the US Bill of Rights, and to the Constitution, and remains quoted reasonably frequently, I believe, in Supreme Court and other court decisions. So it's very important still to their way of thinking about politics and legal tradition.
We probably have time for 2 more questions. We have one in here. This gentleman here in the middle.
I could probably speak from here. Dr. Diggle, all the speakers mentioned how there was a 17th century change in the thinking about Magna Carta. Interested to know what kind of drove that change, was myth-making change in thinking that came around there.
Sure.
Yeah.
It was a moment when, from the point of view of those who were part of political society, a king, firstly James I, but especially his son Charles I, were once again trying to rule without consultation. We're trying to rule in an arbitrary fashion. And therefore, it seemed to be very useful to recall an earlier time when that had happened, in the 13th century under John, and to recall some of the things that the barons had done back then to try and curb arbitrary rule. So there's a couple of things that come out of Magna Carta. It's about the rule of law, it's about putting curbs on arbitrary rule. Now, there's a particular fellow, without going into any great detail, but Edward Cook, who's a great judicial official at the time, who was a parliamentary opponent of the Stuart kings, and he looked back to Magna Carta, but a lot of his version of it that he wrote about was myth-making. But it was extremely influential myth-making. So it takes the origins, but it adds a lot to it that's relevant in the 17th century. So that's where a lot of it comes from.
Why don't we take one last question? You said you got another one from Christchurch, Leo?
I do have 2 more.
Let's get one, and we'll see how we go.
Sure. Okay.
For the Honourable Judith Collins, we have the question, as an MP, how valuable do you think the principles of the Magna Carta are as part of the Constitution, and should we ever discard it?
Well, I think I could say that they're very important. I mean, the concept of the rule of law and the doctrine of rule of law is something which is considered with every bill that goes through Parliament in terms of our Bill of Rights Act. And it's the principles of the Magna Carta are what I believe stays with it and which are part of our Constitution, as opposed to the detail about who was getting rights or whatever. It is actually extremely important. And if you look at all of the common law jurisdictions, this is not unique to New Zealand, although it is very important to our constitutional arrangements. I think back to the issue that Lindsay dealt with about why it's so important in the US, for instance. I think it's because they gave the President the same powers of the King at that time, but it's still very important to New Zealand.
Thank you. Is the next question a short one?
It's yes, it's another short one. They're
Right,
very
let's have it.
succinct.
Very succinct.
Yep. So we have Chris from Canterbury asking, how important is it that we preserve Magna Carta in New Zealand as part of New Zealand law for the next 100 years? And he says that's to Chief Justice Elias.
Well, again, I think it's very important that we preserve the rule of law, because I think it is totally fundamental to the New Zealand Constitution. But whether that is through the actual terms of Magna Carta being enacted by the New Zealand Parliament, I don't know that that is so essential.
I think that'll bring our question period to an end. And so it'll end our session. I would strongly encourage all of you to come to sessions later this week Tomorrow we'll be talking to the theme, what is it now? What is it? The Treaty of Waitangi, the Maori Magna Carta, and themes drawn from there, where Judge Kerry Wainwright of the Waitangi Tribunal and Isaac Hakaka of Lee Simon Long. And the talk will be chaired by Dr. Lisa Chant of AUT down here. Unfortunately, the Attorney General, Chris Finlayson, is going to be missing the panel, but we're very pleased to announce that his place will be taken on the panel by Simon O'Connor, National Party MP for Tamaki and a member of our Magna Carta Commemorative Committee. And he was quite kind and keen to jump into that spot. So if you want to come along, that would be wonderful. So and there's one last thing I should say before we close. The Human Rights Centre, New Zealand Centre for Human Rights, and the law faculty have put on a reception that you're all invited to come down to. It's going to be in room 040B, which is sort of just out here down the left. If you follow people in red shirts, they'll help you get there, okay? It's not that far. And so in closing, I'd invite you to help me thank the panel.